There is a stub of pink granite sitting in a glass case in London, no bigger than a soda can, and it is one of the most quietly disturbing objects ever pulled out of the ground in Egypt. It has a number, UC16036. A curator's label calls it Core 7, and wrapping around its surface, spiraling from one end to the other like a thread cut into a screw, is a groove that should not exist. Not a scratch, not a random gouge, a single, continuous, evenly spaced spiral, cut into one of the hardest stones on the planet 4,500 years ago. Someone drilled a hole into solid granite, snapped out the leftover plug in the middle, and threw it on the ground as waste. And the waste is the evidence. Because the marks left behind on that little cylinder describe a cutting action that engineers today still cannot fully agree on how to reproduce. That is where this starts. Not with a pyramid, not with a pharaoh, with a piece of scrap that a stone worker discarded and forgot, sitting in a drawer for a century until someone looked closely at the spiral and realized it was telling us something the textbooks never mentioned. The official story says copper and sand, that the Egyptians rubbed soft copper tubes against the rock with wet sand until the stone gave way. And part of that is true, but it does not explain the spiral on Core 7. It does not explain the speed, and it does not explain the one detail that made a British engineer stake his entire reputation on the claim that we have forgotten how the ancient world actually cut stone. Today, we are going to walk through exactly what these people did to granite, the tools we know they had, the marks those tools should have left, and the marks we actually find. And by the end, you are going to understand why the simplest question in all of archaeology, how did they cut the stone, is still not fully answered. Stay with me, because the part everyone argues about online is not the part that should unsettle you. The part that should unsettle you is the part almost nobody talks about. Most people who see Egyptian granite never think about it. They stand in front of a statue, a temple column, a sarcophagus polished to a mirror shine, and they see a finished thing. They do not see the act. They do not ask what touched that surface to make it that flat, that square, that smooth. Most people walk right past the real mystery without ever knowing it is there. Because the mystery is not the size of the stones, it is the surface. It is the corners. It is the perfectly round holes. And until you understand what it takes to make those, you cannot understand why serious people have spent their whole lives arguing about a lump of scrap in a museum drawer. Let us be clear about what granite actually is, because this is the whole problem. Granite is an igneous rock formed deep in the earth under enormous heat and pressure. It is a jumble of interlocked crystals, mostly quartz and feldspar, packed together into something incredibly hard and incredibly stubborn. On the scale geologists use to rank hardness, granite sits around 6 to 7. Quartz, the mineral packed inside it, is a 7. And here is the number that starts every argument. Copper, the main metal the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom had, sits at around 3. 3 against 7. That is not a close contest. That is like trying to carve steel with a stick of chalk. Drag a copper blade across granite, and the copper loses. Every time. The metal deforms, smears, and wears away, and the stone barely notices. And yet, the granite got cut. It got drilled, it got sawn, it got hollowed out, and polished to a shine you can see your face in, with a metal that a fingernail is nearly hard enough to scratch. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this entire story, and everything else is an attempt to explain it away. Now hold that contradiction, because we need to meet the people who built the mystery. The granite the Egyptians prized most came from one place, Aswan, in the far south of the country, more than 500 miles up the Nile from the pyramids at Giza. Rose-colored granite, streaked with pink and black, harder and heavier than almost anything else they could get their hands on. They did not have to use it. Soft limestone was everywhere, easy to cut, sitting right next to their building sites. But for the things that mattered most, the burial chambers, the sarcophagi, the obelisks, the colossal statues, they went to Aswan and they took the hardest stone in Egypt. They chose the difficulty on purpose. And that choice is the first thing that tells you they had a way to deal with it. Because no one repeatedly picks the one material that defeats their tools unless they have solved the problem of that material. And we have the crime scene. It is still there, in the quarries at Aswan, lying in the bedrock exactly where it was abandoned around 3,500 years ago, is a single object that turns this from theory into something you can walk up to and touch. It is called the Unfinished Obelisk, and it is enormous. If it had ever been raised, it would have stood around 137 feet tall and weighed something in the region of 1,100 to 1,200 tons. More than twice the weight of any obelisk the Egyptians ever actually managed to stand upright. It was carved directly out of the living rock, 3 sides already freed from the bedrock, the workers slowly cutting it loose from the mountain it was made of. And then a crack appeared. A flaw ran through the granite, the whole project was ruined, and they walked away and left it. They left it half-born in the stone. And in doing so, they left us the single best snapshot of how this was actually done that exists anywhere on Earth. Because the trenches are still there. Around and beneath that colossal stone, the workers cut channels into the granite, roughly 75 centimeters wide. Just enough room for a person to crouch and swing. And the floor of those trenches is not smooth. It is covered in shallow, rounded, scoop-shaped hollows, one overlapping the next, thousands of them, marching across the rock in a rhythm. Those scoops are the fingerprints of the tool that made them. And here is where the second piece of evidence enters. Because scattered all over that quarry, lying in the dust by the hundreds, are the tools themselves. They are balls of stone, dark, heavy, roughly the size of a large grapefruit, not granite. A tougher, denser rock called dolerite, harder than the granite it was used on. Archaeologists have counted them. In one study of the Unfinished Obelisk quarry alone, researchers cataloged 1,419 of these pounding balls, averaging about 14 centimeters across. And this is the part that sounds too crude to be true. The way they cut the trench was to take these balls and pound. Just pound. Lift the heavy dolerite ball and smash it down onto the granite, over and over, crushing the surface a fraction of a millimeter at a time. Some researchers argue the workers did not even hold the balls at the moment of impact, but threw them down and let go a split second before contact. Because holding a 14-centimeter rock as it slammed into granite all day would destroy a person's wrists. It was not elegant, it was not clever, it was brute repetition on a scale that is hard to even picture. And it worked. But here is the first crack in the simple story, and it is a big one. Pounding explains the trench. It does not explain the mirror. Pounding a granite surface with a stone ball leaves it rough, pitted, chewed. It does not leave you a flat, polished plane, or a razor-sharp interior corner, or a perfectly circular hole. The obelisk quarry shows us the crude half of the work, the roughing out, the freeing of the block. It shows us almost nothing about the finishing. And it is the finishing, the sawing and the drilling and the polishing, that produced the objects that keep engineers up at night. Consider what the finished work actually includes. At the great temple complex of Karnak, there is a granite block with a cylindrical hole bored straight into it, around 8 inches across, clean and round, not chipped out, bored, as if by a tool that spun. Inside the Great Pyramid itself, the granite coffer in the king's chamber was hollowed out, and Petri found the telltale evidence of how rows of tube drill holes cut side by side until they almost met, the cores and the leftover ridges between them broken away to scoop out the interior. In 2 places, he noticed, a drill had run too deep and overshot into the wall, a workman's error frozen in the stone. These are not decorative flourishes. They are the marks of a repeatable industrial process, applied to a stone that fights back at every turn. And the same tube drilling shows up at a scale that is almost comic. At one site, Petri recorded a platform of rock dressed down by boring it away with tube drills roughly 18 inches in diameter, the circular grooves overlapping across the surface, done purely to remove material in bulk. Whatever they were doing it confidently, at scale, and on the hardest stone available. So, if a stone ball got the block out of the mountain, what put the spiral into core 7? That is the second clue, and it is the one that turned a debate about tools into a debate about lost knowledge. For a long time, ancient descriptions of Egyptian stonework were treated almost like poetry. The idea of workers boring perfectly round holes through the hardest rock, of sawing granite into clean slabs, sounded to some early readers like exaggeration, like the boasting a civilization does about its own monuments. For decades, that side of the record was quietly filed under legend. Then people started actually measuring the holes, and the legend turned out to be an engineering specification. Enter the man who found core 7. William Flinders Petrie was a British archaeologist working at Giza in the early 1880s, and he was, above all, a measurer. He was obsessed with precision, with getting the numbers exactly right, and he brought that obsession to the granite. He examined the Great Granite sarcophagus inside the Great Pyramid. He examined the drilled holes and the cast-off cores scattered around the site. And what he documented did not fit any tool he believed the Egyptians had. He found holes bored into granite that were clean and round and tapered. He found cores, the leftover plugs from those holes, marked with that continuous spiral groove. And when he calculated how fast the drill must have been sinking into the stone to leave a spiral of that pitch, he got a number so large it stopped him cold. The tool, he estimated, was advancing into solid granite at around 1/100th of an inch with every single rotation. Sit with that because it is the heart of everything. To an engineer, feed rate is the distance a drill sinks with each turn, and 1/100th of an inch per turn in granite is enormous. It is aggressive. It is the behavior of a tool biting into the stone, not gently grinding it. Petri, a careful, conservative Victorian scientist who had no interest in fantasy, wrote that this rate of plowing through the quartz and feldspar was, in his word, astonishing. He concluded the Egyptians must have used fixed cutting points, hard jewels set into the tool, because loose sand simply could not plow a groove like that. He looked at the evidence, and the evidence forced him toward a tool more advanced than anyone wanted to give the Old Kingdom credit for. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next piece is the one that took Petrie's numbers and built an entire forbidden theory on top of them. Because there was a second detail on core 7, and it is even stranger than the speed. Petri noticed that the spiral groove cut deeper through the quartz than through the feldspar. And to understand why that is upside down, you need one fact. Quartz is the harder of the two minerals. Feldspar is softer. In any normal grinding process, where loose abrasive wears the stone away, the softer feldspar should erode faster, and the harder quartz should resist. The groove should be deeper in the soft parts. One engineer took that detail and refused to let it go. His name is Christopher Dunn, a machinist and toolmaker who spent decades in precision manufacturing before he ever looked at Egypt. And when Dunn read Petrie's description of core 7, he did not see an ancient curiosity. He saw a machining signature. To him, the taper, the symmetrical spiral, and above all, the groove cutting deeper through the quartz, all pointed one direction. Dunn argued the Egyptians used a method something like ultrasonic machining, a tool vibrating at high frequency to hammer a hard cutting edge through the stone. The same broad principle behind some modern industrial techniques for shaping hard, brittle materials. He calculated that Petrie's feed rate was hundreds of times faster than a modern diamond drill would achieve. He looked at that little core and concluded that we did not inherit this technology. We lost it. And then, Thousands of years later, we reinvented a version of it from scratch and called it new. Mainstream Egyptology rejects Dunn's conclusion, and we will get to exactly why, because the counter-argument is real and it deserves a fair hearing. But notice what has happened here. We started with a lump of scrap. We now have a continuous spiral, a feed rate that startled the man who invented careful archaeology, and a groove that bites deeper through the harder mineral in defiance of how grinding is supposed to work. Whatever you believe about ultrasonic machines, those three physical facts are on the object. They are not opinions, they are cut into the stone. And they are clue number 2. The third clue is the one that tries to close the case. It is the experiment that supposedly solved everything. And whether it actually did is the question this whole video turns on. For most of the 20th century, the copper and sand explanation was just an assertion. People said the Egyptians ground granite down with copper tools and abrasive sand. But nobody had really done it, measured it, and proved the marks matched. It was a story told to fill the gap. Then, in the 1990s, a British experimental archaeologist named Denis Stocks decided to stop talking about it and actually try. And what he did is the most important work in this entire field, on either side of the argument. He went to Aswan, to the same granite, and he rebuilt the toolkit from scratch. Copper saws, copper tubes, wooden bow drills, sand, and he cut. And Stocks was not the first to try. Decades earlier, other experimenters had attempted to cut granite with copper and abrasive and failed. One early researcher, working with emery powder mixed with oil, reported that he could make no measurable progress at all while the copper blade simply wore away and left the groove coated in useless smears of metal. That failure hardened the belief in some circles that it could not be done, that the ancient work required something we no longer had. Stocks' breakthrough was partly a matter of the right abrasive. He found that ordinary desert sand, rich in hard quartz grains, worked where finer or wrongly chosen abrasives had not, and that dry sand with a smooth blade actually outperformed the wet and lubricated versions others had tried. The debate over exactly what the Egyptians used, plain quartz sand or harder emery and corundum imported from elsewhere, is still live, because different abrasives leave subtly different signatures in the cut. But the core point stood. His results were real, and they matter. Stocks built a copper slabbing saw about 1.8 meters long and weighed it down with boulders, then dragged it back and forth across an Aswan granite block, with quartz sand fed underneath. And it cut. Slowly, painfully, but it cut. In one documented test, his crew ground a slot 3 centimeters deep and 95 centimeters long into the granite over about 14 hours of work. The sand was doing the cutting, not the copper. The soft metal was just a carrier, a way to drag the hard quartz grains across the stone so they could scratch away the surface grain by grain. He did the same with tubular drills, spinning a copper tube with a bow, feeding sand into the cut, boring cores out of solid granite. He produced holes. He produced cores. And crucially, some of his cores showed the concentric grooves that skeptics had insisted only a machine could make. Stocks had shown, with his own hands, that you do not need a lost super technology to cut granite. You need copper, sand, water, and a punishing amount of time. That should have ended it. And in the mainstream, it largely did. But here is where the story refuses to lie down, because Stocks also measured the cost. In that 14-hour test, while the crew cut 3 centimeters into the stone, the copper saw blade itself was ground down by about 7.5 millimeters. Read that again. The tool was wearing away almost as fast as the stone. The copper is not just slowly consumed, it is devoured. And when you scale that up to the reality of what the Egyptians actually produced, the numbers start to strain. They did not cut one slot. They cut and drilled and hollowed hundreds of tons of granite, chamber after chamber, sarcophagus after sarcophagus, obelisk after obelisk, and every meter of that work would have eaten through staggering quantities of copper. Copper that had to be mined, smelted, cast, and hauled. The method works in a test. Whether it works at the industrial scale of an entire civilization's monuments, at the speed the finished objects imply, is a much harder question. And it is not fully settled. And then there is the thing Stocks did not fully reproduce: the feed rate. Petrie's spiral on core 7 described a tool advancing at roughly 1/100th of an inch per rotation. The abrasive method, grinding stone away one loose grain at a time, is slow, and it does not naturally produce that kind of aggressive bite. Replications with copper and sand have made grooves. They have made cores, but matching the exact depth, the exact spiral consistency, and above all that startling feed rate on Petrie's core has remained stubbornly out of reach. The mainstream answer is that the spiral is not really a continuous feed spiral at all, that it is a series of separate rings from repeated drilling, and that Dunn and Petrie both misread it. In fact, when two researchers named Reed and Brownlee physically re-examined the famous core, they reported that the marks were individual rings, not one continuous spiral, and looked like the kind of core produced in any modern quarry. So even the central artifact, the object this entire mystery is built on, is contested down to the question of what its grooves even are. That is the strange shape of this whole subject. Every time you think a piece of evidence has settled it, someone qualified looks again and the ground shifts. Now, here is where the story takes on the texture of every great unsolved mystery. The physical proof is ambiguous. The tools we find in the ground, the dolerite balls, the copper fragments, tell us how the rough work was done, and go quiet exactly when we ask about the fine work. The one artifact that could prove machining, Core 7, is a lump of scrap whose grooves two camps of experts describe in two completely different ways. And the man who might have settled it with the cleanest possible experiment, matching every mark and every rate with copper and sand, matched a great deal and left a few crucial things unmatched. The case is not closed. It has been declared closed repeatedly by both sides, and it keeps reopening. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That the Egyptians had electric machines, or lost power tools, or some vanished super technology handed down and then erased? Probably not. Let us be honest about that, because the truth deserves better than hype. Denny Stocks did the hard, unglamorous work, and he proved something genuine. Copper and sand can cut granite. The abrasive does the cutting. The marks can be reproduced in the real world, and there is no need to invent a machine to explain the basic fact that the stone was worked. The dolerite balls are real, and they really did pound out the obelisk trenches. The bow drill is real. The concentric rings can come from a spinning tube. Strip away the wildest claims, and a skilled, patient, brilliantly organized society with copper, sand, stone hammers, and endless disciplined labor can account for an enormous amount of what we see. That is the strongest version of the mainstream case, and it is strong. But here is what that grounded, skeptical view still cannot quite make ordinary. Strip away every wild theory, and the plain facts are arguably stranger than the fantasy. A civilization working before iron was in common use. Before the pulley, as we understand it, before a single written manual on stonecraft that anyone has ever found, chose the hardest stone in their world on purpose and mastered it so completely that they turned it into mirror-polished statues and dead flat chambers and perfectly round holes. They left a spiral in a discarded core that the founder of scientific archaeology called astonishing, cutting deeper through the hard quartz than the soft feldspar, in a way that grinding is not supposed to do. They cut with a metal so soft it wore away almost as fast as the rock, and they did it at a scale that would have consumed copper like water. And when a modern expert spends a career trying to reproduce every last mark, he reproduces most of them and leaves the sharpest ones just out of reach. You do not need aliens to be unsettled by that. You just need to look at what is actually there. And if even the modest version of this is true, it means something uncomfortable about the story we tell ourselves. It means a society we tend to file away as ancient and primitive possessed a command of hard materials, of abrasives, of precision and organization, that we are only now able to measure and still cannot fully reproduce with confidence. It means that the single most basic question you can ask about their greatest works, how did they cut the stone, does not have a clean, agreed, demonstrated answer. Not because the answer is magic. Because the ordinary answer, when you push it hard enough, still leaves a gap. It means our picture of the ancient world is not a finished portrait. It is a sketch with pieces missing. And if we cannot fully explain the marks on a piece of scrap the size of a can, marks left by people we thought we understood completely, then how much of what these builders actually knew has simply vanished, undocumented, unrecovered? Gone? Think about what that implies. The knowledge to work granite like this was not written down in any manual we have found. It lived in the hands and the routines of the workers, passed from master to apprentice in a quarry, generation after generation. And a body of knowledge that lives only in hands is the easiest kind of knowledge in the world to lose. When the workshops closed, when the last crew that knew the exact rhythm of the exact tool put it down for the last time, the method did not get archived. It evaporated. The objects survived. The technique did not. We are left staring at the output of a process, reverse engineering it thousands of years later, and getting most of the way there and no further. Here is the one question that will not let go. If they could put a spiral into the hardest stone in Egypt that our best experts still cannot cleanly reproduce, and if they left no explanation of how, then what exactly did they know that we have not managed to rediscover? Not a machine, necessarily. Maybe just a method. A trick of the abrasive. A way of fixing the cutting points. A rhythm of the drill. A secret of the sand. Something simple and devastatingly effective that they never wrote down because they never imagined a world that would forget it. And whatever it was, it is not in a museum. It is not in a book. It is encoded only in the marks on the stone, waiting in the grooves of a discarded core in a glass case in London, still cut into the granite exactly where the last person who understood it left it, thousands of years ago, in the quiet, saying nothing. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, watch the next investigation playing on screen right now, because the discovery in that one connects to this in a way you will not see coming.